Welcome to How You Livin', a transformative podcast featuring best-selling author, inspirational speaker, and minister, Dr. Rick Rigsby. And now, Dr. Rick.
Hello, friends. Thanks so much for listening today. You know, a new year offers new beginnings and invites great opportunities to share. Ralph Waldo Emerson said on one occasion, an opportunity missed is an opportunity lost. Don't lose this opportunity to learn about the most significant lesson that you could possibly ever learn. A lesson that will keep you going when you want to give up, that will keep you walking when you want to stop, that will cause you to stand regardless of the storm, circumstance, or situation. It's the most powerful and insightful lesson that I ever learned. It is the most influential lesson that I've ever learned. And it is the hardest lesson in life to implement, but don't let that stop you. This lesson was taught to me by my dad, the wisest man I've ever met in my life, a third grade dropout. The lesson, simply and unwittingly, in my father's simple words, were these: son, just stand. That's it. That's the lesson. 3 words that changed my life. Son, just stand. The lesson is so powerful in its simplicity. The lesson is profound in its resilience. It is life-changing in its application. And amazingly, my dad taught me this lesson on the worst day of my life. Let me go back nearly 3 decades to September the 12th, 1996, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, College Station, Texas. I was a professor at Texas A&M during this time, a time that professionally I was doing very well. Personally, we were crashing. My wife, 6 years earlier, had been diagnosed with breast cancer. We had 2 little boys at the time of the diagnosis in 1991. Fast forward 5.5 years later after that diagnosis to September 12th, 1996. Me and my 2 little boys, Jeremiah 11, Andrew 8, now stood in front of the casket of their mommy and my first wife, Trina. Trina was my college sweetheart. We married following our university days and began our respective careers and would eventually have our young family. 1990 was a promising year for our young family. It really was. I had graduated from the University of Oregon in 1990 with my doctorate. Our family moved from Eugene, Oregon, for me to take my first professorship at California State University, Fresno in Central California. No sooner had we settled, probably hadn't even unpacked all the boxes yet, my wife discovered a lump in her left breast, advanced breast cancer. And she fought hard during 6 years of surgery and radiation and chemotherapy. And finally, on September the 8th, 1996, at 12 midnight, her heart gave out. And although she was finally free of pain, our nightmare was just beginning. And so now, a few days later, it's September the 12th, 1996. And it's the viewing of the body. And while viewing her body and holding tightly to the hands of our sons, I simply looked at my dad and said, Dad, I've lost hope. That's what I said. I lost hope. At the time, I was just 40 years old. Trina was just 41. And for me, all I could see was doom and gloom and despair, loneliness. I could not see at that point that a couple of years later, my heart would beat again, that I would fall in love again, that the first thing Janet would do would be to adopt my little boys and we would go on and have this amazing family. But back on this day, on September 12th, 1996, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, all I saw was a casket. All I saw was normalcy leaving the building. All I saw was a life that I once loved, now vacating the premises. All I saw were 2 devastated, distraught little boys who should never have to walk up to the casket of a young mommy. And all I felt was despair and hopelessness. I cried out to my dad, Dad, I've lost hope. I've lost hope. And that's when my father Wisest man I ever met in my life, y'all. A third grade dropout. Greatest lesson he ever taught me was in front of the casket of my first wife. When I said I've lost hope, my father responded by saying, "Son, you can't lose something God gave you. You haven't lost hope. You've lost perspective. Now, son, just stand." This episode is part 2 of our discussion that I've simply titled Stand. Why? Look at our world. Look at our society. I don't know of a time. Perhaps coming in second place would be the Vietnam War and the racial division of the 60s. But other than that, I don't know of a time that I can think of when we've been more divided. I wasn't born, obviously, during the Civil War, but I just can't think of a time that we've been more on edge as a society. I can't think of a time when there have been more natural disasters, from fires in Los Angeles to earthquakes all over the world to storms everywhere. I can't think of a time where we've experienced more mass shootings all over the world. And particularly here in the United States of America, there is no such thing as a safe zone, no such thing as a safe place. And yet, despite all the negative news, despite all that you hear that speaks of devastation and despair, despite all the interruptions in your personal lives, in my personal life, the death of friends, the death of loved ones, financial calamity, relationships that have gone south, I hear ringing in my heart with a piercing familiarity the words of a third grade dropout. Son, just stand. Just stand. And so, friends, my hope, to be quite honest with you, my prayer is that the simple charge of a third grade dropout will meet you right where you are this very day. You see, it's rarely about the problem. It's seldom about the issue. It's hardly ever about the circumstances. It's our response to those things. As a matter of fact, it is uncertainty that can actually bring the very best out of you. You know, if my father had the vocabulary, that's what he would say. But I like the way he said it. Just keep standing. In other words, you know what I heard that day in front of the casket? Don't quit, son. Don't give up, son. You know what I heard in front of the casket that day? Those are my grandchildren, son. You're my son. And before I change my earthly address and fold my tent, I need to know that I reared a son that would not give up. That's what I heard in 3 simple words. Son, just stand. And so, friends, regardless of the circumstances, despite the situation, the ability to keep standing is really, really key. I love what Denzel Washington said on one occasion. He said, you get knocked down 7 times, you get up 8. Translation, stand. Here's the truth. I didn't want to stand, didn't feel like standing, didn't see a reason for which to stand. But you know what? I've since learned that if all you see is what you see, you really don't see all there is that needs to be seen. And so I want to encourage you over these next several episodes to keep standing. I'm going to point out folks who have stood regardless of the odds. Why? Because standing is not convenient. Standing is not popular. Standing is not in vogue. It's a lot easier to freak out, to flip out, to go out of control, to quit. May I be very honest with y'all? It's a lot easier to make excuses and to blame other people. Oh, baby. Back in 1996, I started by blaming God. Rick, aren't you a pastor? Aren't you an ordained minister? Yeah, but I'm human. And I remember many nights I blamed God. God, how could you? What kind of loving God would allow a 41-year-old mom to die and leave her children and her husband? And I had to work through some rough weeks, some devastating months, some uncomfortable years to come to the conclusion, one simple conclusion: I'm not God, and God is sovereign. I'm not God, and God is sovereign. Every one of us has an appointed time to be born and an appointed time to die. And I'm not God. Will I have questions? Absolutely. Can I encourage you, regardless of whether you are a person of faith or not, just listen to this. Even Jesus Christ had questions. Give me some evidence, Rick. I remember he was praying, the scriptures record, at the Garden of Gethsemane, and he said, "Why hast thou forsaken me?" It's a question. It is perfectly human to ask questions. You'll never intimidate God with your questions. And so I had them. And all I'm trying to tell y'all is this. Standing might produce more questions than answers, but it's worth the price. Standing is never convenient, but it's worth the cost. Standing is never popular, but it's worth the end result. What is the end result? You'll grow. There will be a resilience. There will be a renewal of your faith. You'll have the mindset that you can do all things through Christ who strengthens you. You'll be an overcomer for the rest of your life. You will see life on a very different level, all because you went through an experience that stretched you. You went through an experience that placed an overwhelming burden of tension upon you, and you were able to navigate through that tension. Who is my chief navigator? My God. And the scriptures and the promises, I'll never leave you or forsake you. But who was his earthly quarterback? My dad, a third grade dropout, who simply said, "Son, just stand." And so let me just unpack this. Let me work this out for the next several episodes. Let's be introduced to some folks who stood. I can't wait for the next episode, because the one that comes to mind that I want to feature right now is Martin Luther King Jr. As I'm taping these episodes, it happens to be January of 2025, and we've just celebrated Martin Luther King's birthday. And so in the next episode, I'm going to talk to you about a man who stood, but that's just a small picture. What if I were to tell you that when you stand, you will encourage many, in this case, all over the world, to stand? Well, that's going to do it for this episode. Until we meet again, this is Dr. Rick, asking you the most important question I can ask. How you living?
Are you ready to make an impact in your world right now? Do you want to stop existing and start living your best life right now? Dr. Rick wants to give you the first chapter of his best-selling book, Lessons from a Third Grade Dropout, absolutely free. Just go to www.rickrigsby.com/free gift to get the print or audiobook right now.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.